In the summer of 1245, a Franciscan friar was riding east. Europe was 2,000 miles behind him, his eventual destination many more miles ahead. He carried letters from the Pope. The Holy Father was hoping to dissuade the great Khan, leader of all the Mongols, from any further raids into Europe. And he was even prepared to offer him the gift of baptism into Holy Mother Church. In the Europe which Friar Carpini had left behind, prayers were said almost constantly. The plea was always the same: deliverance from the Mongols. Only 4 years before, the Devil's Horsemen had annihilated both the European armies set against them. But it was more than a military disaster. It was a shattering psychological defeat for which Europe was profoundly unprepared. The Church was the center of all learning, yet to even the best-informed cleric, the lands to the east were a total mystery. They were peopled by strange, fantastical creatures. Christian Europe was seen as an island of civilization and reason set in a sea of monsters and myths. When Europe encountered the Mongol hordes, the experience merely confirmed the horrors of the unknown. Images of creatures from the East filled medieval manuscripts and were uncritically accepted throughout Europe. There were headless beings with faces in their chests, and horned pygmies, Amazons, gold-digging ants, and even men with their feet pointing backwards. These legends were endorsed by the Church, the most important source of knowledge for medieval man. So while the Mongols were building their empire in Asia, all Europe saw was a cloud of myths. The only other part of the world Europeans knew anything about was the place they regarded as the center of the universe. For more than a century, Europe had been obsessed with the Holy Land, the land where Christianity was born. The focus of Christian pilgrimage was Jerusalem. This was the Holy of Holies to both Christians and Muslims, though it had been under Islamic rule for about 500 years. So it became the focal point for 2 centuries of holy war, the Crusades. 150 years before the Mongol invasion of Europe, Pope Urban preached the First Crusade. Soldiers of Christ were promised a place in heaven. They set out to destroy the infidel and to regain this holy city for Christ. Ranged against them was the sophisticated world of Islam. It was a society no less driven by religious zeal. The Crusaders eventually stormed Jerusalem in 1099. Then, in God's name and in a self-righteous rage, they hunted down and slaughtered almost every non-Christian they could find. They behaved like any other invading army. Across the Holy Land, the Crusaders set up kingdoms and principalities. To defend them, they built formidable fortresses, like this one in northern Syria, Crac des Chevaliers, Castle of the Knights. It has been called the most perfect castle ever built. Muslims called it a bone in the throat of Islam. Crusaders called it the key to our lands. But the Christian God's protection of the Crusaders did not last. Under the great Muslim leader, Saladin, Islam won back its lands. And although Crac des Chevaliers held firm, Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187. Islamic supremacy had been reimposed 88 years after Christians had taken the holy city. News of the loss of Jerusalem horrified Europe. It was said that the true cross had been lost in the battle. The ailing Pope allegedly died of shock. Europe was in mourning. In its anguish and its despair, Christendom turned to religious rumor and legend. A myth had arisen around a mysterious and marvelous figure who held sway somewhere in the unknown lands of the farthest east. If somehow he could be contacted and his help enlisted, he might be the salvation of Europe and her beleaguered armies in the Holy Land. Prester John, a priest king, ruler of all the East. This was Christianity at its most wishful. The stories about him probably came from ancient legends of the Magi, wise men of the East. As reports appeared in letters and chronicles describing this Christian king in the Orient, hope grew. Jerusalem and the Holy Land could be retaken. Pictures were passed from church to church, each more imaginative than the last. Medieval maps often included an enthroned Prester John. Then the myth was enhanced by rumors of distant events. The great Islamic cities of Samarkand and Bukhara had been reduced to rubble. Muslims were under attack by a mysterious foe who sprang from nowhere and disappeared again after destroying Islamic armies. Muslims were dying, and if someone was killing the infidel, it had to be Prester John. The myth was now unquestioned, and Europe celebrated. Salvation was not far off. God had answered their prayers. But it was no priest king who had conquered the Muslims. It was Genghis Khan and his hordes. Europe, desperately clinging to its fantasies, was completely unprepared for the shock when, 20 years later, the Mongol armies invaded and sacked Poland and Hungary. God himself seemed to have abandoned Christendom. The tragedy was beyond comprehension. The end of the world was come. For Christian Europe, if the Mongols were not the savior, Prester John, then they were the Antichrist, the harbingers of Armageddon itself. The Church claimed these devil horsemen were divine punishment for the sins of man, none other than the foul people of Gog and Magog, servants of Satan, who would be let loose at the end of time. The medieval chronicler and monk Matthew Paris claimed that the Mongols ate their prisoners, and this was accepted as fact, even though most Europeans had never actually set eyes on a Mongol.
We shall send these Tartars back to hell where they came from, or they will send us to heaven, which awaits the chosen.
But Armageddon was postponed. The Mongols left Europe after the death of their great Khan, Ogadai. Europe feared that they would return, so here at Lyon Cathedral, the new Pope, Innocent IV, convoked a council to seek a solution to the Mongol threat. The Pope wanted to find out the real intentions of the Mongols and, if possible, to convert them to Christianity. So, from this throne, he sent an envoy across the world to find and talk to the Mongol leaders. He chose a monk from the newly formed Franciscan order. Thus it was that, in the summer of 1245, John of Plano Carpini, a 65-year-old friar, set off for a destination which lay far beyond the limits of the then known world. Carpini carried letters from the Pope addressed to the Emperor of the Tartars, asking him not to attack Europe again and offering the gift of baptism into the true faith. Carpini was also ordered to observe everything he could about the barbarians, their customs, their dress, the size of their flocks and herds, how they lived, how they fought, everything. The monk and his few companions rode for month after month for thousands of miles. It was summer when he started. He was on to the Asian steppe by the autumn, and then the winter came. At times, food consisted of gruel cooked in melted snow. For an elderly cleric, the journey was an astonishing feat of physical endurance. Carpini saw many strange and terrible things, including the skeletons of recent Mongol victims. But he didn't come upon the fabled monsters he had expected to find. For days, he and his companions would travel without seeing anyone else. Then Carpini encountered the first Mongol encampments. At first, they looked on him with some hostility, but when they learnt that he was on his way to the great Khan, he was given an escort.
To tell of their good points first, the Tartars show considerable respect to each other and are very friendly together. They willingly share their food with each other, though there is little enough of it. The Tartars are quite different from other men, for they are broader between the eyes and across the cheekbones. They have a flat nose, their eyes are little, and the men hardly ever grow beards. They drink mare's milk in very great quantities. Their dwelling places are like tents and are made of sticks and covered with felt. Wherever they go, be it to war or anywhere else, they always take their dwellings with them. They have such a number of horses that I do not believe there are so many in all the rest of the world.
At first, Carpini was not able to make out much about their religious beliefs. The truth was that they had very few, but he did notice that they always offered their idols the first milk of every mare.
It is impossible to put down in writing all their evil characteristics on account of the very great number of them. The Tartars' food consists of everything that can be eaten. They eat the filth which comes from mares when they bring forth foals. Nay, I have even seen them eating lice. They would say, "Why should I not eat them, since they eat the flesh of my son and drink his blood?" They are men who are dirty in the way they take food and do other things. They make their hands dirty with the grease of the meat, and they wipe them on their leggings or the grass or some other such thing. They consider it a great sin if any food or drink is wasted in any way, and they give bones to dogs only when the marrow has been removed.
Karpini continued on to the east, towards the heart of the Mongol homeland, to meet the great Khan himself and attempt to carry out his Christian mission. A year after he had set out from Lyon, he arrived at the imperial camp just outside the capital city. Again, he observed the Mongols' religious practices, determined as he was to convert them to Christianity. He found that the Mongols themselves practiced shamanism, based on worship of the elements, and centered around the divinations of the shamans, or clairvoyants. Their supreme god was heaven, Tengri, but they also worshipped the spirits of fire and water, the earth, the sun, the moon, mountains and rivers. The shamans were powerful, and their chanting was full of significance for the conduct of daily life. But what amazed Karpini was that because shamanism had no doctrine or written laws, it could be practiced alongside any other religion, and the Mongols actively encouraged this. Chinese Taoism, for instance, had been the first foreign religion the Mongols allowed to flourish. Muslims were also living and practicing freely among the Mongols. And Buddhism was another religion which must have intrigued Karpini. All these faiths maintained their religious and cultural identity under the Mongols. Mongol military ruthlessness coexisted with an almost total religious tolerance. But what really astonished Karpini was to find a flourishing Christian community in Asia. These were Nestorians, or Eastern Christians. They had settled across Asia in the 5th century and, even today, still worship in Aramaic, said to be the language spoken by Christ. Karpini had heard of the Nestorians, but only of those living near Jerusalem and Baghdad. He had no idea that they had spread so far east. As for the Mongols, they were unconvertible. They merely incorporated aspects of any religion which they thought had merit, a kind of celestial insurance.